Well, last time we looked at what we might call Sellars' process nominalism. That's not really an appropriate name for it, in that he isn't really a nominalist anymore. He agrees with nominalists, including his earlier self, on what there isn't. Universals, abstract propositions, facts, and so on. But on the positive side, it's of the essence of nominalism to think that what exists is what's referred to by proper names. Proper names, not onomatoids, if you remember that expression. So not things that just on the surface have the form of names or singular terms, but things that really are. But now he's not a world of particulars nominalist anymore. He thinks what there is processes, indeed abstract processes. That is, processes that can be specified in principle without referring to objects, and in a generalized sense that doesn't even require that processes have duration, temporal duration, though they have some generalization of that. And he gestures at, but I think not more than that, some sort of mereological operation of combining processes or of discerning sub-processes in processes according to whatever this generalized version of duration is. But the paradigm of it is a process that's a sub-process of another because it's a temporal segment of it. Now, I'm not going to pursue that process notion anymore because I think what's interesting about Sellars' nominalism, in whichever form it is not so much the positive metaphysics of it, but the negative metaphysics of it. That is, the reasons that he gives, the arguments that he gives for taking it that a whole variety of things are not in the world in the narrow sense, as he puts it, not in the world as it would be even if there never were discursive practices or practitioners. And I think we can actually distinguish 9 kinds of things that he thinks aren't in the world in the narrow sense. Facts, states of affairs more generally, picked out by nominalizations of sentences. Universals, picked out by nominalizations of monadic predicates. Relations, picked out by nominalizations of polyadic predicates, including complex predicates in Dummett's sense that are formed from complex sentences by the method of observing invariants under substitution, basically quantifying into them. Kinds, which are picked out by terms, but sortal terms rather than singular terms. He's okay with the sortals themselves, but the nominalizations of them, moving from lion to lions, there he says you've crossed, to lionhood, moving from lion and to lions to lionhood, you've crossed the boundary. Now, that's a metalinguistic expression that is not referring to something that's in the world in the narrow sense. He's added in that second Karras lecture events. I say added it. It was striking that he devotes so little time, really, to arguing for the unreality of events and temporal relations generally. You remember what the general form of the argument there was, that you get events by nominalizing sentences that are formed using temporal connectives. And it's the fact that those are connectives that relate, that are thought of as relations between what we then have to think of as events as the relata of those relations, but all of that's a projection into the world, shadows of syntactic facts that you've mistaken sentences formed with temporal connectives, you've mistaken the grammar of that, and then nominalized everything in sight. In fact, though I didn't have the wit to mention this last time, this is a long-standing concern of Sellars, not something that he just dragged in there at the last minute in the Keras lectures. Locus Classicus is his massive 120-page essay, Time and the World Order, which is unsatisfactory in many ways. I think it's virtually unreadable. He never caused or even allowed it to be collected in the various collections of his work. It just sort of sat there. And virtually none of his commentators have written about it, with the exception of one of his last PhD students, Pedro Amaral, who has also been responsible for recovering a bunch of Sellars' lectures, particularly his Notre Dame lectures. But Amaral has edited that long essay into a book, written an introduction to that book that's nearly as long as the essay. I don't believe that that's been formally published yet, but it's been kicking around in some eSdot. Amaral thinks it's a really important piece of work. So far, he's the only one, but that's the point of the book, is to make that case. At any rate, Sellars had been worried about events beforehand. But still going down the list of things that Sellars argues are not in the world in the narrow sense, what's referred to by alethic modal vocabulary, subjunctively robust relations of consequence or incompatibility. I've suggested those are more important alethic locutions than necessity and possibility that modal logic has focused on. Also on the list are anything that would be referred to by a term that was introduced by abstraction from other expressions. That's in a broad way, in a broad sense, a kind of nominalization. Abstraction introducing a new term by treating an equivalence relation relating old terms as an identity relation for the new terms. And he says, no, that moves you out of the world in the narrow sense. Meanings, not in the world in the narrow sense. Wouldn't have any meanings if we didn't have any discursive practices. But that as an instance, because he thinks of locutions that apparently refer to meanings as really having the function of classifying expressions according to the normative role that they play in the language. So for him, the extrusion of semantic locutions means and even refers from the world in the narrow sense is actually an instance of a more general extrusion of normative phenomena, which again he's going to give a metalinguistic analysis of. I said I think that this negative metaphysics, this methodology of analyzing expressions as covertly metalinguistic, and so as not having reference in the world in the narrow sense, in the sense which is independent of a linguistic practice, on the basis that metalinguistic locutions require object language, object languages, and the object languages aren't in the world in the narrow sense. So there's nothing for metalinguistic expressions to refer to in the world in the narrow sense. Now, I think there's a worry that Sellars' method is a kind of aqua regia. Aqua regia is an alchemical term for a universal solvent, something that could dissolve anything. Seems to have been inspired by mixtures of hydrochloric and sulfuric acid that could dissolve just about anything. But in the ideology of alchemy, thinking about the aqua regia, so, well, what would you keep it in? How could this substance be utilized if it dissolves everything? Then it couldn't be transported, couldn't be used, so on. Is it even, in the end, a coherent concept? But we use it as an image for a universal solvent, something that would dissolve everything if permitted. And I think there's a worry that everything could be argued to be metalinguistic in Sellars' terminology. He started out with the insight, at least on my reading of it. What inspired him to the new way of words was Carnap's introduction, following Tarski, his exploitation philosophically of the notion of metalinguistic and covertly metalinguistic expressions as a way of talking about Kantian categories. Paradigmatically, what's expressed by a lethic modal vocabulary. Here was a category of concepts that arguably were framework explicating in the way that Kantian categories are, that is, whose principal expressive job was not to describe or explain empirical goings on, but rather to make explicit features of the framework within which it was possible to describe and explain. And the idea that those were metalinguistic concepts, that was a bolt from the blue that inspired Sellars. And now he could see how to go on with this Kantian thought. But he generalized it substantially from that case to saying, well, there aren't any events, there aren't any facts, there aren't any properties or relations in the world in the narrow sense. I mean, this question of whether everything is going to end up being excluded from the world in the narrow sense is one of the central data points in thinking about Sellars' picture, following at least one strand in Quine, to think of conceptual appearances of a non-conceptual world. Concept use, grasp of a concept is mastery of the use of a word. So no words, no concepts. We can't understand the conceptual apart from understanding discursive practice. So anything conceptual is banned from the world in the narrow sense. And, I've raised the question of whether, in the end, a picture of a non-conceptual reality, such that all of our understandings are conceptual appearances of it, whether that's actually an intelligible conception, and pointed to the opening of the introduction of Hegel's phenomenology as maybe the first place that that question was really pressed. Well, I mean, if you take that line, facts are something we can't understand at any rate apart from sentence use. They're what's stated by sentences. On the other hand, we can't understand what particulars are, what objects are, apart from thinking about singular term usage. It's in this regard, particulars are in the same boat as properties or relations. We only at least understand them in terms of the use of a certain kind of expression, of singular terms, of predicates, of relational words. Now, I've argued that's a matter of sense dependence, not necessarily reference dependence. So there's room for us to allow such things in the world in the narrow sense. But I think it's hard to see how the same grounds that Sellars uses to argue that there aren't any facts, which he thinks of in Strawson's derisive phrase as sentence-shaped bits of reality. I mean, that's the sort of rubric under which one is suspicious of them. But it's just not clear that those same considerations don't go for singular term-shaped bits of reality, namely particulars. Particulars and what's expressed by singular terms and what's expressed by predicates, those go hand in hand. They seem like they're on a par. It looks as though the same considerations that lead him to expel from the heaven of the world in the narrow sense properties and relations are going to apply for particulars as well. Processes, absolute processes, he says that's what corresponds to verbs and head verbs, not to nominalizations of them, but to the verbs and the head verbs. But again, correspond to something we can at least only understand in terms of the use of verbs and adverbs. There's a danger of that methodology being too corrosive and sort of applying to everything. Then we get a world of things in themselves, Dinge an sich, about which we can't say anything. That's the real Kantian view, following that out. Now, I think there is a distinction to be made. His argument against there being objects that are properties, things referred to by words like redness and color as the sortal that goes with them. Those are arguments about the metalinguistic character of those terms. Those are not arguments against there being things that correspond to properties and relations, and as far as that goes, sentences in the world. The involvement of language in those is different than in the explicitly metalinguistic case. And I want to have something to say about that later on. I mentioned at the end last time what the motivation for the discussion this week is, that Sellars faces what Hugh Price calls a bifurcation problem. Sellars thinks that only some uses of linguistic expressions are descriptive uses. He needs that when coming in from the one direction, he distinguishes describing from labeling. Descriptions are situated in a space of implications, he says. They're not merely classifying by differentially responding. His anti-descriptivism, when he says, once the tautology, the world is described by descriptive concepts, is freed from the idea that it's the business of all non-logical concepts to describe, the way is clear to an ungrudging recognition that many expressions which empiricists have relegated to second-class citizenship in discourse are not inferior, they're just different. Well, he's carving out a subclass of expressions that, or maybe uses of expressions that are descriptive there, and arguing that it's a philosophical mistake to be a descriptivist, that is, to assimilate all the uses of expressions to descriptive uses. The beginning of wisdom is to make that distinction. Well, Price says you've got to make that distinction. You've got to explain how to bifurcate, how to distinguish descriptive from non-descriptive uses. And when in the protasis of the Scientia Mensura passage, he says, in the dimension of describing and explaining, science is the measure of all things. That restriction is substantial. He explicitly, in other places, says that that's meant to put normative expressions outside the scope of science's preeminent authority, because he understands those as not having their principal use be descriptive uses. Well, okay, but which are the descriptive uses then? In order to pick out the world in the narrow sense, that's the world as described by ultimate natural science, the Peircean framework. Well, what is that? What is that describing? Now, I want to start off by saying something about the general philosophical sort of problem this is, the general surround in which this bifurcation problem arises. I want to say that there's actually a nested set of uses that we should distinguish. The broadest of which, and these are senses of descriptive, maybe most generally of fact stating, or of representation. You can have for each of these versions of an anti-descriptivist program. Later Wittgenstein, for instance, tells us, warns us not to take it that just because the surface grammar of some expression is a declarative sentence, that we should not assume from that it was in the job of stating facts or of describing how the world is. He's thinking of things like I'm in pain, which is a perfectly good declarative sentence, but he wants to say it's not stating a fact, it's not describing some way the world is. Don't assume that just because something is a declarative sentence that its principal use is to state facts or to describe how things are. Characteristically, the later Wittgenstein doesn't go on to say, well, what is that job of work? How does something have to function in order to be describing or stating a fact. Sellars doesn't do this job of bifurcation, though I want to argue that he gave us all the raw materials we needed to make all the relevant distinctions in the vicinity. And the later Wittgenstein and Sellars may have thought they didn't need to do this because Wittgenstein had already done it in the Tractatus, where there's a picture of fact stating, representing, describing, laid out in exquisite detail. The later Wittgenstein reproaches his younger self for assuming that any use of a declarative sentence must be descriptive in the Tractarian sense. And though I've said fact stating, descriptive, representational, and you could certainly make distinctions among those. You might well want to draw lines between them. But on this issue, I think these things go together. The Tractatus is a representational picture. It's an account of describing. It's an account of fact stating. And it's sort of at that level that the dialectic I want to describe takes place. Well, there is whatever job of work declarative sentences are doing. There's a proper subclass of that, I think, that are descriptive uses, a proper subclass of those that are empirical descriptive uses. And then I want to say, even within empirical descriptive uses, Sellars is committed to there being a proper subclass of those that are descriptive use, empirical descriptive uses in the narrow sense, that is, empirical descriptive uses that describe things in the world in the narrow sense, that is, where the use of those descriptive expressions doesn't depend on, well, anyway, where what those descriptive uses describe isn't reference dependent on, isn't dependent for its existence on the existence of discursive practice. And the mistake that the later Wittgenstein reproaches his younger self for is taking a notion of that narrowest kind of description and assuming that everything that is sayable at all must be assimilated to that model. So that if you're stating facts at all, you must be stating them in the Tractarian sense of fact stating. And now you see, modal facts aren't in there. He really wanted to give an account of probabilistic facts, but the ones that he's giving, the account that he gives is extremely implausible because you can't think of probabilistic statements as a matter of the arrangement of objects such that any properties they have in virtue of which they can picture are just a matter of the relations among the objects. To get an account of modal facts or probabilistic facts, never mind normative facts, if such there be, or facts of aesthetics, that's a Procrustean tool then. That sort of descriptivism. Here's my model of descriptions. Now I'm going to apply that to everything and say, either you can make sense of it that way or there's something bogus about it. That's descriptivism, is taking something that's lower down on that hierarchy, a model of description, and applying it to everything above it. That's that mistake. But I think there's a complementary mistake, what I call declarativism, which is understanding everything inside the widest category in an undifferentiated way that denies these distinctions. That's making the mistake from the top down that descriptivism is making from the bottom up. In each case, it consists of basically denying all the intermediate distinctions and either using the characterization of the outmost realm to understand everything inside in an undifferentiated way, or using the narrowest thing to understand everything outside it. In either case, it's a failure to appreciate the significance of the intermediate distinctions. And I think the possibility of those twin mistakes, those two ways of ignoring the nested distinctions, I think this comes up very often in philosophical disputes, in particular because the best arguments for descriptivism, the bottom-up failure to appreciate the distinctions, is that you see what's wrong with declarativism. You say, no, this model isn't going to apply. It's going to rule some stuff out. You're failing to appreciate what's special about our narrow. And the best arguments for declarativism are seeing what the failures are of descriptivism, saying, oh, no, there's more things going on than you've got here, so let's not treat that as special. Let's say what the declarative things have in common. And I'm saying that the root mistake of both of them is to fail to appreciate the significance of the intermediate distinctions, or to just fail to draw them at all. So we can take the Tractatus as the paradigm of descriptivism, having a picture of fact stating or representation or description that's very narrow. It applies as to statements like the frog is on the log, the cat is on the mat. It doesn't evidently apply to statements like courage is a virtue, as Rorty, for instance, is fond of pointing out. It's of the essence of Hugh Price's arguments for global expressivism that that sort of descriptivism is a bad model, not just for the sorts of expressions that lead Rorty to a declarativist thing, but also for statements of fundamental physics, statements about time. Indeed, I think an interesting project would be to compare Price's arguments for anti-descriptivism, anti-representationalism about the time variables that appear in fundamental physics with Sellars' arguments against the reality of temporal relations. I don't think anyone has done that. And if that diagnosis of the debate between people making a declarativist mistake of seeing no substantial distinctions, embracing the widest characterization on the one hand, and descriptivists who see only a narrow one and in a Procrustean manner try and fit everything into that model, and insofar as it doesn't fit, having an invidious attitude towards what isn't of that model, saying, well, there are no such things, there are no such facts, you're not really representing anything. The common mistake is not drawing these distinctions, not carving out the descriptive locutions from the more broadly fact-stating declarative case, not distinguishing within that empirical descriptions, and the narrow ones, well, we've got to extrude covertly metalinguistic empirical descriptions, if such there are. So let me say something about the widest category here, the declaratives. That's the most general sort of fact-stating discourse. The freestanding use of declarative sentences has the default pragmatic significance of asserting, of making a claim, and those assertables are embeddable as the antecedents of conditionals and can be negated, as Geach emphasized. They can be truth evaluated. We can say, yes, that's true, or no, that's not true of them. But mind you, Geach reminds us that that's true of statements like, John should not have done that. That those are fact-stating in this broadest sense. I can say John should not have done that, and you can say that's not true. He was entirely justified, or that was the right thing for him to do. And I can say, well, if John shouldn't have done that, then he should have understood the reasons against it, embedded in the conditional. Geach, in the descriptivism piece, and he has a companion one that focuses on negation rather than antecedents of conditionals. Truth evaluability is a very broad category. Basically anything expressible by a declarative sentence. It contrasts with interrogatives, asking questions. If I say, should John have done that? Well, that isn't something you can say, well, that's not true about my question. It's not something you can embed as the antecedent of a conditional. In asking that question, I haven't stated a fact, even in a very broad sense. There are other things you can do with sentences besides making declarations, making claims, making assertions. That's a very broad sense of fact stating. And the conclusion Geach draws in these essays is basically the declarativist one, that this is what it means to state a fact. I sometimes have talked about the iron triangle of discursiveness that relates the fundamental speech act of making a claim, stating a fact, purporting to state a fact, in this broadest sense, on the pragmatic side, asserting, with declarative sentences on the syntactic side, and with truth evaluability, expressing a proposition in the broadest sense of that on the semantic side. And one of the first tasks, as I see it, of a philosopher of language is to have an account of this fundamental use of language, what I take to be downtown in discursive practice. That is, I don't think any practice that doesn't accord some of its performances the pragmatic significance of assertions, of claimings, properly deserves to be called a discursive practice. It can be a fragment of one, but any autonomous discursive practice, I think, has to have assertings in it. So, for instance, I think that interrogatives and imperatives are fundamentally parasitic on declaratives. One consequence of this is that I think many of Wittgenstein's Sprachspiele, what he calls language games, aren't really Sprachspiele. They're vocal games, but not really verbal games. In particular, the slab language that he opens the investigations with has performances that the builder can make that are appropriately responded to by the assistant by doing one thing rather than another, bringing a slab, bringing a pillar. But they're not properly imperatives, because imperatives are not just performances, even noises, vocal, that are appropriately responded to by one range of activities and not by another. Imperatives distinguish what the appropriate response is by describing it, by saying what it is, by saying, shut the door. And that's not intelligible in a context in which you can't say, the door is shut. And I would say similarly for interrogatives, is the door shut? Is not just a performance, the appropriate response to which is, well, it's easier in the case of interrogatives, making a claim. Can't have questions without answers. I mean, globally, can't have practices of asking questions without practices of giving answers, which are claims. So we have this broad category, and in response to his arguments about truth evaluability and embeddability, Geach draws the conclusion, well, look, this is what we mean by fact stating, and in that sense, lots of normative expressions are fact stating, and probabilistic and modal statements, anything you can put in a declarative sentence. For declarativists who use fact stating in this very broad sense, that program is given aid and comfort by deflationary theories of truth. Theories of truth that take the Tarski T sentences as giving you everything you really need to know about the use of truth. Because there's T sentences that go with any declarative sentence. I can say, John ought not to have done that is true, just in case John ought not to have done that. That's the truth evaluability that goes along with embeddability here. So Paul Horich has quite a sophisticated approach to truth and, by the way, meaning, based on the idea that the Tarski biconditionals are telling you everything about that you need to know about truth, extended to saying, and the name Leibniz refers to Leibniz, a set of statements like that tell you everything you need to know about reference. That's how he gets an extension of meaning. I think the most sophisticated and ultimately satisfactory version of those deflationary accounts of truth is the broadly prosentential or anaphoric approach. That's the one that I articulate in chapter 5 of Making It Explicit. But for a global expressivist like Hugh Price a decade ago, the fact that you can give this account of truth evaluability that goes with this very broad notion of fact stating, of representation, says, well, that's what there is. Let's think of that general case. And don't make the mistake of thinking that all facts must be Tinker-Toy-Tractarian facts. That's a descriptivist mistake about fact stating, indeed about description in the most general sense and representation. When Sellars in CDCM says it's only because the expressions in terms of which we describe objects locate these objects in a space of implications that they describe it all rather than merely label, one of my favorite passages. He's giving a necessary condition on description officially. What it's a sufficient description for is declaratives. That's because asserting and inferring go hand in hand. What's assertable is what can play the role both of premise and conclusion in an inference. And the implications are the relations that underwrite those inferences. But if that were all Sellars had to say about describing, if being situated in a space of implications was intended not just as a necessary condition on description, but a sufficient one, then what he would have picked out would have been the declarative sense. And that won't support his objections to descriptivism or the restriction in the Scantia Mensura of science's authority to descriptions. That's too broad. It includes the fact that John shouldn't have done that, and he means to exclude it. So, in favor of a declarativist understanding of fact-stating descriptive uses, representation, it responds to the Frege-Geach embedding worry. It is underwritten by deflationary accounts of truth and truth evaluability that say that this just comes for free with being a declarative sentence, that you're truth evaluable and so have truth conditions, formulable in some vocabulary or other. And it avoids what Price calls the bifurcation problem. It avoids your saying what you mean by descriptive or fact-stating or representational in an umphier, more restrictive sense. You don't have that philosophical job of work if you just say, well, really, we can do everything we need to do at the level of declaratives. Now, if you do that, you mustn't combine it with Tractarian-type descriptivism that says, okay, and now let me tell you what describing, fact-stating, and so on is. It's things that work on this model. If you combine those, that's when you're obliged to be metaphysically extravagant about the kind of facts you admit. Because now you're committed to understanding all of the facts in the declarativist sense on something like the Tractarian model of arrangements of objects. And then you're going to need normative relations between objects, merely probable relations between them, subjunctively robust ones, and so on. This is a characteristic sort of 20th century analytic philosophical issue that was raised first in the teens, pre-Tractatus, by Russell's logical atomism, agonizing, yes, but are there negative facts? Are there conditional facts? What would they be like? What is the fact that cats are not dogs, or that there is no present king of France? What kind of facts are those? And of course, the Tractatus was the entering edge of a wedge in saying, oh, there are logically complex facts, but they're not like basic facts. You can't understand them on the model of basic facts. Let me tell you about the relation between facts in the strict sense, basic facts, and what's expressed, the facts that are stated by logically complex expressions. And we were sort of off to the races. Advantage of declarativism, what led Rorty and Price to join company with him. If you have any sort of narrower model of representation, description, fact stating, it's really hard to understand facts like justice is a virtue, romanticism overreacted to the troubles of the Enlightenment, Cézanne taught us to look at visual surfaces differently, or Sellars was a deeper thinker than Quine. All facts and important facts, but anything like a tinker toy model is going to have real problems with what you're saying when you say those kinds of things. What's striking about Price's way into this is he thinks fundamental physics use of temporal variables is as hard to understand on a restrictive representational or fact stating model as any of the things that I just mentioned, and for reasons not entirely different from them. Okay, so we got declaratives at the top, and at least the model of the Tractatus somewhere down at the bottom. What bright lines are there along the way? Different things you can mean by fact stating, descriptive, representational uses. If you grant that not all declarative uses, not all truth valuable, embeddable uses are fact stating, descriptive, or representational in the narrower senses that we're distinguishing. Where are the joints that we should be cutting at? And on this question, as far as I know, Sellars never explicitly addresses it, even though his systematic views demand that he have answers to these questions. His anti-descriptivism does, the scantia mensura scientific naturalism, scientific realism does, and his view about the world in the narrow sense does. But I think Sellars gives us all the conceptual raw materials we need to draw the crucial lines in the vicinity. So that's what I want to proceed to do. So the first thing, I think, the beginning of wisdom here is to ask, what's the contrast class with descriptions? So the contrast class with declaratives is imperatives, interrogatives, other sorts of forces other than assertional that one can attach to sentences, other kinds of sentences whose principal use is perform different kinds of speech acts besides asserting, claiming, and fact stating in the broadest sense. And at the crudest level, the distinction was between descriptive uses and prescriptive uses. Hume wants to distinguish is claims from ought claims and say, we've come to think, I think implausibly, that you can't infer across that boundary. Had his own view about the world in the narrow sense that didn't include prescriptive uses in it. But he saw an affinity between those and alethic modal expressions and extruded them from the world in the empiricist narrow sense as well. But prescriptive uses, that's at least one kind of broadly normative one, that was the original contrast class with description. And we can ask, well, can we be any clearer about what that distinction comes to? And so carve out within the declarative realm a more narrowly descriptive set of uses of expressions, or expressions whose typical use is one of those descriptive ones. If we're careful, we should talk about the uses, because there are almost no expressions, all of whose uses are descriptive uses. But they're ones, well, that's its standard use, that's its basic use. That's the one, those are the uses in terms of which you have to understand the other uses and so on. Strictly, it's the uses, but we can talk about loosely about the expressions. And here I think Anscombe has done our work for us with her notion of directions of normative fit between words and the world. And I trust that this is familiar, but I believe in making things explicit, so I'm going to quickly rehearse her story. So she imagines two people who do not speak to each other, a shopper and a detective following the shopper. And they each have a list. And the shopper has a list made up over the last week of what she wants to buy that day. And she consults the list, and if onions are on the list, she goes and puts onions in the basket, and so on. The detective who's following her has a list, and every time she puts something in the basket, he will tell she bought onions. Onions go on his list. And if everything goes well, the two lists will be identical at the end. They'll just have the same things on them. But the relation between the list of terms and the items that those terms refer to are fundamentally different in the two cases. And you only see that if there's a divergence. If the shopper's list doesn't match what's in the cart, the mistake is in the cart. Something was supposed to be there that isn't, or is missing that was supposed to be there. In the case of the detective's list, if his list doesn't match what's in the cart, the mistake is in the list, not in the cart. So we can say that the shopper's list has the word-to-world direction of normative fit. The words are supposed to fit what's, has the world-to-word The shopper's list has the prescriptive direction of normative fit, where the words are authoritative over the items in the cart. The things in the cart are responsible for their correctness to what's on the list. That's a prescriptive direction of fit. The detective's list has the descriptive direction of fit. If there's a mistake, if there's a disparity between the items and the list is wrong. That has the word-to-word direction of normative fit, where the items in the basket are authoritative over, are a standard for assessment of the correctness of the words. The words are responsible for their correctness to what's in the card. Now, this is not surprisingly a philosophical story of Wittgensteinian simplicity and I think significance as well. We can understand how those practices work. And we can understand it in terms of where the standard for assessment of correctness of things resides. And it makes sense to think of these as the prescriptive direction of fit for the shopper's list and the descriptive direction of fit for the detective's list. And I think that's necessary and sufficient to carve out a narrower realm, a narrower thing to mean by descriptive. And with it, corresponding senses of fact stating, as we can think of the items on the detective's list as stating facts. You know, he could just as easily have written, she bought onions, potatoes, and so on it, stating facts. Whereas if we expanded the items on the shopper's list, they would be something like, I should buy onions, potatoes, and so on, which, though declarative, are prescriptive rather than descriptive. Now, obviously, there's lots more we would like to say about this. In this sense, some describings will have prescriptive consequences. Say, the light turned red, so you should stop, for instance, is an inference from an implication of a prescription by a description. So we have to be careful about how we think about this distinction. But if we think about uses of expressions, we have these two directions of fit. We can think of them as detecting and effecting, if we like, detecting uses, responding to how things are, and affecting uses, changing how things are. There are crucially more complex combinations of these basic normative directions of fit. A test operate, test exit cycle, where the robot sees whether its hand is on the knob or not yet, and if it's not, moves its hand and checks again until it gets the result the hand is on the knob. That test operate, test exit cycle, that involves combining descriptive and prescriptive, detecting and effecting moves, combining them in a particular way by a conditional branch schedule algorithm. That's how computers can do what they can do, but those are built up out of these prescriptive and descriptive uses. So, requiring the descriptive direction of normative fit, the world-to-word direction of normative fit, carves out a proper subclass of declaratives as descriptive in a narrower sense. And that is a normative characterization. I think it's best thought of in terms of authority and responsibility. You define the normative fit by what functions as the standard for assessments of correctness of what. And in that sense is authoritative. And the other side is what's being assessed for its correctness is responsible to that authoritative thing. So, I mean, this is available to Sellars, as I say. I think Anscombe gave us the philosophical account that we need here. So that's the, I don't know, I hope in the handout, have a little picture here. In the realm of declaratives, we can put the prescriptive uses off to one side. Here. That bifurcation isn't hard, I want to say. I mean, there may be hard cases for it, but in general, to see what you're after, that's not anything that should scare Hugh or that he or Rorty ought to object to. Yeah.
I have a question about the application of direction of fit. So within the realm of declaratives, all of those sentences are truth-bound, if we go to deflationism. Well, for Sellars, and I think also intuitively, truth is a normative notion. Assertions aim at truth. Sellars, at the end of Truth and Correspondence, says, well, when we're saying something's true, we're really saying that it's assertable. So in that sense, do all declarative sentences in some sense have a descriptive direction of fit, and that we want our assertions to correspond to the way things are?
Now, you surprised me. I expected from the way your remarks started off that you were going to say, well, isn't there a prescriptive element in them, because don't assertions aim at truth? Isn't that the norm of assertions, is truth? So aren't they actually subject to a sort of meta-prescription, say, of what is that it is, and so are broadly normative? So I was surprised that starting off that way, you came around to asking, well, isn't everything descriptive?
Well, yeah, I was thinking that both descriptive and prescriptive uses of language are subject to a meta-prescription because the notion of direction of fit is a normative notion. But I was thinking that, even though all of them, all uses of language would be subject to a meta-prescription, we can still distinguish between the descriptive and the prescriptive uses. And then I was thinking, well, the mark of a descriptive use, almost by definition, is that the norm for the use of language is that it corresponds or reflects something other than the use of language itself. And I thought, well, that thing is the truth.
Well, you could. Making sense of a line like that is one way of thinking about the task Blackburn sets himself for his quasi-realism. Again, you've got to explain the truth of valuability and the and corresponding, it seems like these are two expressions of the same phenomenon, the embeddability of normative declaratives by seeing some sort of fact that they state, even in this narrower sense that they're obliged to reflect it. And his view is, well, we should talk about normative facts in in prescriptive uses of declarative sentences. So we have prescriptions that are imperatives. Indeed, that's the home language game of prescription talk, is not sort of describing the norm, but embodying it. Part of the force of the imperative is giving the order or making the request. And hence the permanent temptation to think of the declarative normative expressions as parasitic on proper prescriptions, which are imperatives. So if you think Hare has this as a proposal. And that's where Blackburn and in a different way Alan Gibbard go, saying the principal phenomenon is prescribing in a non-declarative sense. And if you want to understand, the declarative use, you have to understand it as parasitic. And one way of doing that is seeing the prescription as bringing a state of affairs into existence. So now, the superior gives the command, and the subordinate now has a different status, is now obliged to fulfill the command. This is all very uncomfortable. Hegel sees part of the titanic sea change that was the rise of modernity out of traditional forms of life as being moving beyond the form of normativity that was superior subordinate, obedience of superiors to subordinate, the command and obedience model into something more egalitarian recognition and so on. But the thought is in these still traditional, Hegel says, pre-modern terms, that the command by the superior institutes a new state of affairs that we can think of as a normative state of affairs because now we can describe it anyway in broadly in declarativist terms. But what then distinguishes those normative statements is that there is nothing that stands to a genuinely descriptive or immediately descriptive expression as the imperative stands to the normative description. Nothing that instituted that state of affairs. So in the case of the shopper, we can say that because if we expanded, we could expand the items on the list, or we could imagine that the lordly master of the house had written this list for the housekeeper and might as well have written, you must buy, or just buy these things. And those would have been the original prescriptions, in virtue of which the normative relations that we can describe come into existence. So, I mean, all of that is optional, but there is that special relation between at least some imperatives and some normative expressions. I mean, just as deflationists about truth are deflationists about semantic facts, they say, look, it is a fact that, quote, snow is white is true, but that's just the combination of the fact that snow is white and the fact that, quote, snow is white says that snow is white. So we can be deflationist about that, just so you can be deflationist about normative facts and say they don't need to be connected to prescriptions in order for us to see normative facts as describable by us. And indeed, you might think that there must be some kinds of normative facts that are not. For instance, the description of the relation of superior and subordinate, in virtue of which the commands of the superior institute obligations. Was that instituted by a prescription, or is that just a fact? The essence of the traditional worldview was it's just a fact. It's the great chain of being, of subordination and superiority, which includes animals, vegetables, and minerals at the bottom of it, but goes up through lords and ladies and kings all the way to old Nobodaddy. But that was thought of as just a fact, that chain of who was superior and subordinate, who had the capacity, not just the right, to institute obligations by their utterances. Okay. I think it makes sense to carve out a narrower yet notion of description, and that Sellars tells us how to do it with his Two-ply account of non-inferential reports. Remember, there he said any concept use is normative, subject to assessment of its correctness. He could focus in the kind of reports he takes as paradigmatic on ones that have the right direction of normative fit, have the word-to-world direction of normative fit. But some of them, in addition, some tokenings you can be entitled to, you're justified by there being exercises of reliable differential responsive dispositions. Okay, this is my way of filling in his story. Those are the ones that have observational uses. No concepts have only observational uses. I can see that something's red, but I can also infer it from the wavelength or from its being a ripe Macintosh apple. But what's distinctive of these paradigmatically empirical descriptive uses is that in addition to that normative direction of fit, tokenings of them can stand at the end of reliably covarying chains of events, or chains of reliably covarying events. The clapper strikes the body of the bell, the air vibrates, the vibrations are propagated through the air, they cause a vibration in your tympanic membrane, and the issues, if you're properly situated, standard conditions for this, properly wired up and properly trained, and you're saying, oh, the bell's rung, from which you can infer class is about to begin or something like that. That is, for these paradigmatically empirical descriptions in observation, in addition to this normative semantic definition, where we're going to assess correctness, there's also an alethic modal dimension of subjunctive dependence, where we could say, if the clapper hadn't struck the body of the bell, you would not have asserted that the bell had rung and the meeting was going to begin. Again, if you're in the right circumstances and you're wired up properly and trained properly, there are these one-way subjunctive dependences. Now, there are more empirical uses of concepts than observational uses, because purely theoretical concepts can be are empirical concepts as well, in virtue of their relation to concepts with observable uses. They're inferentially connected to them. And those inferential uses transmit not only the normative direction of fit, but also the subjunctive dependences. So my claim that the meeting's about to start, well, that's not what I heard, but it's extending the chain of reliably covarying events that led me to say and perceptually judge that the bell had rung, and my inference, so the meeting's about to begin. Well, again, that's subjunctively tracking, not just the ringing of the bell, but the beginning of the meeting, at least if it's a good inference that I'm making. And it's of the essence of Sellars' view, this is what justifies the claim that the distinction between theoretical objects and observable objects isn't an ontological one. They're not different kinds of things. It's just an epistemological one. In the one case, we know about it in a way that essentially involves an inferential link, and in the other way not. His argument for that involves the fact that this line can move. I get a new instrument, and I don't need to make the inference anymore, or I just get better at telling Toltec pot shards from Aztec pot shards, so that I don't any longer need to rehearse my textbook list of what the differences are. I get so I can just tell. In the myth of Jones, this is what we saw. That is, for Sellars, to say that something is a theoretical object, what's referred to by theoretical terms, terms that now only have inferential circumstances of application, none of those are essentially unobservable, necessarily unobservable. We always could be better situated, have an instrument that changes the chain of reliably covarying events that links us to it, and so on, so that it would be observable. I think that's suggesting that what matters for empirical description, that includes description using theoretical entities, is still just something that is two-dimensional in the way that non-inferential reporting is for him. It has the normative descriptive direction of fit on the semantic side, And on the epistemic side, there's a condition of one-way subjunctive dependence. If we talk about this in terms of representings and representeds, then I'm suggesting we can carve out a narrower than merely descriptive class of uses by adding to the descriptive direction of fit that we have for the descriptive full stop, adding this subjunctive dependence condition and say empirically descriptive representings are normatively governed by the representeds in the sense that the representeds have a certain distinctive kind of semantic authority over them. Namely, they serve as standards of correctness for the representing as a representing of that represented. So this is true of descriptions generally. I'm sort of filling in the Anscombe point a little bit. So I'm saying there's this semantic dimension of normative governance of representings by representeds. But that's matched by subjunctive tracking of the representeds by the representings. Subjunctive dependence of the representings on the representeds. That's describing our epistemic connection to them. And if some of those links are inferential, then it's a theoretical application of the concept. That is, if some of those are language-language moves, if the subjunctive dependence includes language-language moves and not just language entry moves, then it's a theoretical, empirically descriptive use rather than an observable one. But still adding this alethic modal dimension that we see in the paradigm of empirical descriptions, when I not only say the frog is on the log, but I say it because I see it. That essentially involves these two dimensions. And we can see how to generalize that using Sellars' own conceptual apparatus. Now, what kind of descriptions might not be empirical descriptions in that case? Well, think about the descriptions in a novel. Fictional descriptions. I can describe the house of my character. We can talk about the fictional facts, if you like, that I'm the ones that I'm describing, but there isn't going to be the ones that I truly described, but there isn't going to be that sort of subjunctive tracking of anything by the fictional claim. I mean, I can make false claims about Sherlock Holmes, but that's because I'm answering to the story. But when Conan Doyle was writing the story, he wasn't answering to them. So anyway, it seems to me that the narrower category that Sellars cares about really is empirical descriptions that have both of these dimensions. And by distinguishing those, we're getting closer to the restriction he means to make in picking out the world in the narrow sense. I don't think we're there yet, but we're getting closer to that. Yeah, John.
I had a question about the classification of fictional descriptions. It seems like there are two uses of fictional language. One is the one that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was employing when he wrote the Sherlock Holmes novels. When you start out with when you begin when you write a fiction, you aren't describing a fiction that's already in existence. You bring the fiction into existence. In that case, it doesn't really seem to me that there's a normative direction of fit going on. Then there's a second use of fictional descriptions, which is where we talk about what goes on in the Sherlock Holmes stories. In that case, there does seem to be the direction of fit, but I also wonder if there's the subjunctive connection. Like we read the Sherlock Holmes stories, and it seems like that establishes a subjunctive dependence upon what Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote and upon what the
Yeah,
stories are.
as I think the stories are authoritative in the second case, and we can say no, it was 221B Baker Street they lived at, not C. You got that detail wrong, or his brother's name was Mycroft, and in spite of the other stories, he didn't have a sister. We don't know about his maiden aunt. That there isn't a fact of the matter about. Yeah, I think there's no problem with the second saying the kind of fact it's that we're empirically tracking in that case is what it says in the stories, or maybe immediate consequences. Maybe it includes immediate consequences of it. Presumably the coachman that took them from here to there had a mother, even as though she wasn't mentioned in it. But those first uses, I agree. The story about fiction would have further twists in it. That is, what do we mean when we say that Dickens described the house in excruciating detail? Well, that language gets to be descriptive because it could have been used to describe in the primary sense where it would be true. All those things could have been true. They weren't true. They're false, but they're false descriptions. And furthermore, they're not merely false. They're false in the way distinctive of fiction. And what is that? You need a theory of fiction for that. Don't have one in my back pocket, but we can say sort of what they carry over to those uses. For instance, their location in a space of implications, even though the consequences of them still might be false in that not just false, but fictionally false sort of way. I've run us till late for the, well, we started a little bit late, but why don't we take our 15-minute break now and come back at 2:51. Okay, so treating this two-dimensional deontic and alethic or normative and alethic criterion, semantic normative governance, and on the epistemic side, subjunctive tracking or subjunctive dependence on as at least a working hypothesis of an important line in the vicinity that's smaller than description in general, narrower, as I say, is getting closer to what Sellars means and needs for his talk about the narrow world, how reality in a narrow sense and in a wider sense that includes discursive practices and their products. I want to, on the one hand, ask, well, what more would he need, if anything? How well does this serve to pick out the world in the narrower sense. There's three ways into that notion, I think, we have. I mean, the overall one, and the one I think is sort of in the driver's seat, is thinking, well, this is the world in all the ways it could be, even if there never were any discursive practitioners. That corresponds to, to a strain of thought in Kant. We read Simonelli, who argues that it depends on a two-world reading of Kant. I can see it as corresponding to a two-aspect account as well, in which case, we just want to know, well, what features could things have considered independently of our knowing of them, or there being knowers of them. But I think that's the principal notion that he has in mind. He does use the notion of description and explanation in the Protasis of the Scientia Mensura passage, clearly aiming at what he would later talk about as the world in the narrow sense. Talks about description and explanation. A few years later in CDCM, he tells us the descriptive and explanatory resources of the language advance hand in hand. They're really two sides of one coin. And it's clear there that what he means is the space of implications that, at any rate, empirical descriptive expressions are situated in have to be subjunctively robust implications, or at least have to include subjunctively robust implications. So we have the sort of reference independence of discursive practice. We have description and explanation, which brings in the subjunctively robust dependences issue. And we have that natural science is to be authoritative over descriptions and explanations of the world in narrow sense. And so I think it's worth confronting his, litany, his long list of kinds of things that get left out of the world in the narrow sense, and ask, well, if we use this double-barreled criterion of describings being normatively governed by what's described on the semantic dimension of assessments of their correctness as describings, and the subjunctive tracking of describeds by describings, that is, the subjunctive dependence of features of the describing uses on what's described. If we use that as a criterion for looking at the things that he's left out, that he's extruded from the world in the narrow sense. So first on my list here is facts. Does that criterion rule out there being facts in the world in the narrow sense? I don't see that it does. The motivation for that two-dimensional deontocolithic characterization was what's observable, taking that as the paradigmatic empirical descriptions are observations of how things are, non-inferentially elicited descriptions or statements of facts. But I can see that the light is red. That's a fact. It's observable. Whether the light in fact is red or not normatively governed, serves as a standard of assessments of the correctness of the claim that I've made. But if I'm in standard conditions and I'm wired up and trained properly, my claims that the light has turned red subjunctively track whether the light has turned red. If the light had not turned red, I would not have claimed that the light had turned red under those circumstances. That criterion doesn't rule out facts from the narrow world. And, I can see, well, it's red that I saw the property. I saw what color it was. Its relations, I can see that the door was between the cat and the cat food. So if I don't open the door, but I can see that the door was between the cat and the cat food, the relation, kinds. Well, I can see that Fido is a dog, not just that he's brown. I can see that he's a dog too. Events, I can hear the snap of my fingers. Again, both dimensions, normative governance, semantic, subjunctive tracking. No reason on that way of understanding empirical description to think that the world that's empirically describable doesn't have these kinds of things in it. Subjunctive relations. Why did you move the wine bottle closer to the center of the table? I could see it was wobbling and might fall. I could see the possibility of that happening. Why did you grab the toddler's shoulder? Because I could see that he might burn himself on the stove. Possibility. Again, I can perceive that. Normative issues. Well, people have thought you can't non-inferentially observe normative states of affairs. But as we talked about when we were considering the two-ply account of observation way back in connection with EPM, it just doesn't seem to be true. I can see that Nietzsche could see that the beating of the horse was cruel. Anyone in standard conditions and properly brought up would see that for fancy kinds of normativity. But one of the revolutions in the psychology of perception, our understanding of perception, well, psychologists' understanding of perception a generation ago was shift to a Gibsonian paradigm of affordances. Gibson says, thinking about non-linguistic animals, but also about us, that it's wrong to think about what they immediately perceive as being shapes and colors and textures. Wrong on evolutionary grounds, wrong in terms of psychological perceptual mechanisms. What they see is what he called affordances, possibilities of something playing a given role in the lived life of the animal. They see something that's edible or something that could eat them. They see a place they could hide. They see a gap they could fit through if they need to. And any perception of the colors of things, for instance, is first of all probably beyond them, but if not, they need to be carefully trained to abstract the color from it, because what matters is not that the thing is red, but that it's edible. red in those circumstances means you can eat it. Affordances are functional and they're normative. It's a good place to hide or a bad place to linger because you're out in the open and something could get you. They involve perception of possibilities and consequences, but also of proprieties of things. And certainly for us, when the Gibsonian framework is applied to human perception, it says, look, you don't first see the door handle in terms of the geometric shape that you have there. You see it as a way you could open the door, as being for opening the door. You see the traffic light as controlling the traffic, as the thing that controls the traffic. You pick that out, in the nighttime cityscape. There's lots of red and green lights, but what you see is the traffic light, or at least you'd better pick that out of the clutter that way. So the Gibsonian framework at least suggests that perception of possibilities, sort of alethic modal properties, and of normative properties don't even require discourse to have differential responsiveness to things that would taste good, things that are a good place to hide, places better avoided, and so on. So if that's what we mean by empirical description, the two-barreled normative governance and epistemic tracking by subjunctive dependences, we're not going to get down to as spare a world as Sellars' negative metaphysics demands, and what puts him in a box with genuine nominalists, even once he moves over to being a process theorist. Now, when I sort of designed this course, I thought something like that would be where I would end up in assessing where Sellars had gotten to. The slogan was really his achievement was a theory that should be thought of as formulated in a pragmatic metavocabulary, a vocabulary for talking about what we're doing when we use terms like lionhood or greenness. That what we're doing is something best understood in metalinguistic terms, just as he's explicit that his account of the use of meaning talk is what you're doing when you talk about meanings is functionally classifying expressions. And that there's a big difference between those interesting metalinguistic analyses of what we're doing when we use these expressions, on the one hand, and what we should semantically say about the content that we're expressing when we do that, on the other hand. That's something we'd express in a semantic metavocabulary. That's the one that bears on sort of what we're talking about. And that Sellars just never got clear about the relation between these. And in some sense, none of us have ever gotten clear about it. There are all kinds of puzzles about the relation between what you express in a pragmatic metavocabulary, talking about what you're doing when you use expressions, and what you express in a semantic metavocabulary that talks about what you're saying when you do that. And in my Locke lectures, in between saying and doing, I talk about many different kinds of relations that there can be between semantic and pragmatic metavocabularies and other kinds of vocabularies that build up these relations. But in thinking through this material and thinking about what resources Sellars really had available to bring to bear in justifying his way of carving out a notion of the world in the narrow sense that is as much a desert landscape as he's clearly aiming at, that is the negative metaphysics, the stuff he wants to leave out. What resources does he have that could enable us to say, look, this isn't just a failure to see or a confusion or something, but something he was after that he couldn't quite articulate, but there was something there. I thought of his argument in some reflections on language games, where he's distinguishing, he wants to distinguish between genuinely rule-governed activity and merely regular activity. So merely regular activity is properly described by a rule, but no rule is being followed. It's not sort of because of the rule that the behavior is this way. And I mentioned at the time that I thought his ingenious argument, which gets us well beyond the paradigm issue of the paradigm around which the literature on rule-following considerations focuses, which is sort of me following a rule now, that he usefully gets beyond that. And remember the way he makes the distinction, it's rule-governed rather than rule-following exactly. And this was his way of making something of Kant's distinction between two ways in which rules can result in regularities. He says everything in nature happens according to rules. Kant says it's regular, there are laws of nature. This is his way of talking about the subjunctively robust relations of consequence and incompatibility that articulate our empirical concepts and our understanding of nature. Everything happens according to rules, but only some things happen according to conceptions of rules. Vorstellung is his word, representation. We act not according to rules, or not only according to rules, but according to our understanding of rules, according to our grasp of rules, according to our representation of rules. He says, literally, though it's usually translated in that context, conception of rules. And remember, Sellars' move there was to say, well, something is rule-governed if a representation of the rule plays the right causal role in bringing about the regularity. Representations of rules don't matter at all for laws of nature. Right? Representation, the law of gravity would be what it is, that regularity would be if no one had ever represented the law of gravity, had ever discovered it or anything. The representation of the rule plays no role in the bringing about of that regularity. But how is it that children call squares square? Well, they get taught, because that isn't something you can learn in unsupervised learning, because the noise could be associated with any shape. They get taught by teachers, and the teachers, as the supervisors of the learning, who are saying, that's correct, Johnny, no, that's wrong, they can think about what they're doing. What are you trying to do? I'm trying to get him to use the term square for square things. As they can recite to themselves, they have mastered the concept, they have the use of the word, and they can remind themselves, maybe it's tough for square, but we're trying to teach him blue and green, and now we've got this intermediate shade. Well, no, I at least want him to call really green things green and blue things green, and maybe this one doesn't matter, but they call the rule to mind. They at least can call the rule to mind. And if the rule they call to mind were different, if that representation of the rule were different, they would induce a different regularity in the kid. So the grasp of the concept by the people who have mastered the use of the word and so have representations of the rules, even, it sounds as silly as saying call red things red, but think about some mathematical concept. You say, no, I only want him to apply this case to small categories, not to all of them. The teacher might have to bring this rule to mind in inducing the regularity in the student. And so Sellars says, well, that's the difference. What's rule governed is if a representation of the rule, some tokening of a statement of the rule, plays the right kind of causal role in bringing about the regularity, then it's rule governed. And we can think about that in terms of subjunctive dependences. If that representing of the rule were different, the regularity would be different. Again, with the usual qualifications. Well, that was an invocation of the role of discursive representings in bringing about a regularity, in bringing about a subjunctive dependence. So it seemed to me, only relatively recently did it occur to me that you could carve out a narrower notion of empirical representations if you had the thought, well, there's some empirical representations that meet the dual criterion, normative governance and subjunctive tracking, but the subjunctive tracking essentially depends on linguistic expressions, on linguistic tokenings. Think about this. This was the case that first occurred to me. Think about it in connection with abstractions. Can I non-inferentially observe abstract objects? Well, some of them, I can see that there's 3 apples there. Now I can't see that there's 1,001 apples, but 3 is an abstract concept, and I can see the 3-ness of it, the triplicity of it. Well, okay, suppose that's right. That's for a property of a set of apples. The number is a property of the set, but suppose I can see that. That's not a pure set. That's a mixed set, because the elements of that set aren't sets. They're concrete objects. They're things I can see. What really motivated nominalism, that 1947 Quine and Goodman essay is locus classicus for this, was a horror of pure set theory, of set theory where the elements, the ultimate elements, the elements that are not themselves, that don't themselves have elements, are things built on the empty set. The things used in von Neumann numbers. The empty set, the singleton that contains the empty set, the doubleton that contains the empty set and the singleton of the empty set, and so on. Now, could I subjunctively track those objects, those pure sets, without going through representations of them? Is it in principle possible for me to do pure set theory using only empirical descriptions? That is, where there's normative governance, okay, by the way it is with the sets of the correctness, serving as a standard of correctness for my claims, no problem with the normative governance. I can talk about pure sets, about von Neumann numbers. That I can do. Can I empirically describe them so that if things were different with the pure sets, what I say would be different? Well, yes, I can do set theory, at least simple set theory, and if those things were different, I would say different things. Yes, but could I do that where the chain of reliably covarying events that connects me to the pure sets didn't involve representings of them, tokenings of linguistic expressions for them? Almost certainly not. I mean, that's my way of accessing them, is by writing things down that refer to them. And those things can subjunctively track the abstract objects. So it seemed to me, even just among sort of halfway down the list of things that aren't in the narrow world that Sellars, that we're trying to draw boundaries around on Sellars' behalf, there's kinds of abstractions where I can subjunctively track them, but only because I can use linguistic expressions that refer to them. And there's other things where that's not true. The frog being on the log, I don't need to infer that from something. Sellars' view that these other kinds of expressions are metalinguistic, that property expressions or fact expressions are metalinguistic, might be the view that our capacity to deploy those expressions descriptively essentially depends on the wing of subjunctive tracking, essentially depends on representations of them. Just as everybody could agree that meanings aren't in the world in the narrow sense, because nothing is conceptually contentful except in virtue of the role it plays in discursive practice, and we're thinking about the world as it could be if there were no discursive practice, so there would be no meanings in it. But some kinds of abstract objects there wouldn't be in it either if we restricted our notion of empirical descriptions to a narrow class of them, narrow description, narrow empirical description to match world in the narrow sense, where one half of what's needed for empirical description, the alethic modal subjunctive tracking epistemic relation to them, if that epistemic relation, as opposed to the semantic one, if that epistemic relation essentially requires intermediate steps that are discursive representings of the situation, discursive representations of anything. It needn't be of that situation. If some expressions are, as we might say, essentially metalinguistic, that would be to say that our capacity subjunctively to track the situations in which that metalinguistic expression was applicable depended on the existence of object language representings that the expressions we're using are metalinguistic on, or in a metalanguage for. Now, this would just be applying the move that Sellars made, as it were, on the output side, thinking about rule governedness of doings. This is combining that with the two-ply account of observation, thought of as a paradigmatic kind of empirical description, which was the basis for this two-dimensional semantic normative governance and epistemic subjunctive tracking of things. But if the epistemic tracking essentially required representings, discursive representings, conceptually contentful expressions, the use of conceptually contentful expressions, that's what would be most parallel to some reflections on language games, invocation of the role of representings of rules. So if it essentially went through concept use, because grasp of a concept is mastery of the use of a word, that would be discursive practice, then we could say that even expressions that were not about concepts could be implicitly conceptual and metalinguistic in this particular sense of metalinguistic, the sense I've never actually seen anywhere except in Sellars. Metalinguistic in the sense that properly using this expression can only epistemically track what it's an expression for in a way where one of the intermediate things that's co-varying with it is a linguistic expression, is a tokening, a representing that is conceptually contentful. Now, where I wanted to sort of end up with the course was by contrasting the difficulties that there are, as I see it, in telling a story of the broadly nominalist kind that Sellars is, that has a purely non-conceptual world that is conceptual, appearing to us in conceptual shape. And I mean, in any case, next time, to tell you a clean and I hope convincing story about how we can get concepts on both sides, or conceptual structure on both sides. Doing what, for the conceptual appearances of a conceptually structured reality, what Sellars doesn't even begin to do, but would have to in order to work out his account, which is tell us how to get conceptual pictures, conceptually shaped pictures that include sentence use and predicate use, event claims, abstract alethic modal expressions, and so on, as picturing features of his spare desert world in the narrow sense, where all of the ones in many of those various kinds above all, the propositional, which introduces the conceptual to begin with, are picturings of kinds of togetherness that the particulars or the absolute processes, whatever the denizens of that spare, non-conceptually conceived or constituted world is. So he doesn't really begin to tell us how that could be for his new notion of processes and sub-processes. But where I wanted to end up, and where what I'll do next time is talk about this conceptual representings of a conceptual world, how to make sense of that conceptual realism. But though this move isn't going to get us any further in explaining the unity of the proposition as a picture of some kind of subprocess relation, that work is still going to need to be done to make sense of conceptual appearances of a non-conceptual reality. It now seems to me that Sellars has substantial resources for defining a restricted notion of empirical description in a narrow sense, that would rule out things that are metalinguistic in the ordinary sense, things that are metalinguistic in some of the senses that he has picked out for us. Lethic modal vocabulary is not metalinguistic in the ordinary sense. He argued that it's covertly metalinguistic. Well, here's a thing to mean by that the only way you can learn to track subjunctively robust relations of consequence and incompatibility is by learning to use expressions discursively in inferential practices. That's a way of translating his view that what you're doing when you say all A's are necessarily B's is endorsing a rule of inference. Well, that by itself, I think, would not rule lethic modal connections out of the world in the narrow sense. But if the only way I could subjunctively track the lethic relation between A's and B's is by using the expressions A and B, needing representings, conceptual representings of A's and B's in order to do that. That would be enough to make them not describable by empirical descriptions in the narrow sense. Now, as I say, this thought is, on Sellars' behalf, is recent enough that I can't claim to have walked far enough down the road to see how much of what he wants he could get that way. But it does seem to me this is a distinctive, I think it would be to him, notion of metalinguistic, way of being metalinguistic. That does not require that to be metalinguistic, the thing you're talking about has to be an object language or some part of an object language. That it doesn't. It's just that in order to talk about it, the only way you can epistemically satisfy often enough the semantic requirement, get it right. That is, if the thing you're talking about were different, what you're saying about it would be different. If what makes that true requires a contribution by concept application of other expressions along the way, that's a way of being metalinguistic that Sellars would surely want to treat as sufficient to exclude something from the world in the narrow sense. So that's the best I can do on his behalf. It seems to me this is a thought worth pursuing. As I say, this sense of metalinguistic, I don't think anybody's ever worried about before. And it seemed to me that it draws a line within abstract terminology between, that would put pure set theory on the far side, where I'm really pretty sure that our capacity to epistemically track in a subjunctively robust way pure sets essentially does depend on representings of conceptual representings of things along the way. Less clear to me that that's true of sets of three apples, even maybe of singletons of apples, but the difference between the empty set and the singleton of the empty set, can I make that distinction without depending on representings of it? Seems to me plausible not. And if not, that suggests that this criterion is at least drawing an interesting line, and one that's potentially helpful for Sellars in this task of excluding what he wants to exclude from the world in the narrow sense. I mean, with motivation, that's and furthermore, it's his move that I'm invoking here. So, I mean, I want to say, this is the last part of the handout, that the raw materials that I've drawn on in order to make sort of all these bifurcations, draw these bright lines within the declarative, is picking out the declarative by locating things in a space of implications. That's his general inferentialism. His anti-descriptivism. There's other things you can do besides describe. The two-ply account of observation from EPM, thought of as giving us the paradigm of empirical descriptions, the characterization of the observable theoretical distinction as epistemological rather than ontological. The thing we're after, the distinction between the world in the narrow sense and the world in the broader sense. His general practice of giving broadly metalinguistic analyses of, I want to say, what you're doing when you use various expressions. And then this final piece of the puzzle, not final in that it completes the puzzle, but in that it's the last one to go on the table as far as I was concerned, is this Some Reflections on Language Games idea of rule governedness understood in terms of he says, causal role played by representings of rules. Whether causal talk is the right kind of talk, I prefer the subjunctively robust dependence notion. We know that these don't coincide. There are subjunctive dependencies that aren't causal. There seem to be singular causal relations that don't involve subjunctive robustness, even though these things are intimately related. But whatever, the one I think I understand better is the subjunctive robustness, so that's the one that I choose to understand the Some Reflections on Language Games in those terms, because then it can be carried over into the second of the two dimensions that I suggested were involved in empirical description, normative governance, and subjunctive tracking. So it started off saying, look, there's this challenge, bifurcation challenge that Sellars has got, that in each in their own way, declarativists and descriptivists miss, because they make the common error of not making these distinctions in between. Everything is either understood, all the declaratives are understood on a Tractarian descriptivist model, or we just treat all the declaratives as fact stating in the same sense. Those are both making the mistake of not drawing these lines, but there are natural ways to draw these and productive ways of drawing these lines. And the last thing I was offering is the last line, that distinctive sense of metalinguistic that goes along with some reflections on Language Game's notion of rule governedness. Okay, so next time, bit of a survey, conclusion, reminder of where we've been on this journey through Sellars' thought, but also a way of taking his basic ideas and elaborating them into a conceptually realist story about conceptual appearances of a conceptually articulated world that I think is more promising and convincing than the Sellarsian, even though everything I've ever done has just been a series of footnotes to Sellars, and so all the raw materials that I'm deploying are Sellarsian raw materials. See you next time.